There is a moment in the process of awakening that almost no one talks about, a strange moment, quiet, difficult to explain. It is not exactly sadness, it is not exactly emptiness, but something has changed. Suddenly, things that once seemed important begin to lose the weight they used to carry. Conversations that once held your attention now feel shallow. Goals that once felt essential now seem distant. Plans that once gave meaning to the future now feel irrelevant. And a question slowly begins to appear. What is happening to me? Maybe you have felt this recently. Maybe you have noticed that something inside you has shifted, but you cannot quite explain what it is. You continue living your life normally, but internally, there is a strange sensation, as if you were observing everything from a different place. Almost as if you were watching your own life from the outside. And then something even more unsettling begins to happen. The things that once felt urgent no longer feel that way. The need to prove something, the need to impress someone, the need to chase goals that once felt fundamental, all of it begins to lose its force. And this can be deeply confusing, because throughout our lives we were taught that motivation is normal, that wanting things is natural, that pursuing achievements, experiences, success, is what gives life meaning. So when suddenly that internal drive begins to weaken, the mind becomes conflicted. It tries to understand, it tries to diagnose, it tries to explain. Maybe it is exhaustion, maybe it is stress, maybe it is lack of purpose, maybe it is even depression. But there is something curious about this state, because while some things begin to lose their importance, something inside you begins to grow quieter, more attentive, more present. It is as if the mind is slowing down, as if the internal noise is fading. And within that silence something begins to emerge, a different perception, a perception that is not based on desires, ambitions, or expectations, but on something much deeper, awareness. And this is where many people begin to feel lost, because when the old engines of life begin to fail, it feels like something essential is breaking. But what if it isn't? What if something is simply ending? There is a very specific phase in the awakening process where the meaning of things begins to change, not because life has lost its value, but because the old meanings can no longer sustain the new perception that is emerging. It is as if you are looking at the world with the same eyes, but seeing something completely different. The same streets, the same people, the same places, yet something has shifted in how everything is perceived, and this can create a deep sense of disconnection. You still participate in conversations, you still perform the same activities, you still follow the same routines, but internally there is a distance, as if part of you is observing everything with a new clarity, and that clarity can be unsettling, because it begins to reveal something that was once invisible, that many of the things that seemed important were simply constructions, social constructions, cultural constructions, psychological constructions, stories we learn to tell ourselves about what it means to live a successful life. But when awareness begins to expand, those stories start to feel fragile, and then one of the most delicate moments of awakening appears. The moment when the old system of meaning begins to dissolve, and before a new one can emerge, there is a gap, a silent space, a space where nothing seems to carry the same weight it once did. And it is exactly in this space that many people begin to think something is wrong with them. But what if this space is not an error? What if this space is actually a transition, a passage between two completely different ways of perceiving life? Because what we call loss of importance might not be a loss at all. It might be a quiet liberation. A liberation from expectations that were never truly yours. But before we can understand that, we need to look deeper into what is actually happening inside the mind during this process, because what feels like emptiness is often just space, and what feels like absence may be the beginning of something far more real. There is a deep reason why this stage of awakening feels so unsettling. It is not only because things begin to lose their importance, it is because, for the first time, you begin to notice something that has always been present, yet rarely recognized. Most of what we call meaning in life is not something that naturally emerges from within us. It is learned, constructed, slowly installed over the years. From a very early age we are taught what should matter. We are taught what success means. We are taught what it means to become someone important. We are taught what it means to live a life that is considered meaningful. These ideas do not appear violently. They appear subtly, almost invisibly, first through family, then through school, then through culture, then through the constant comparison with others. And little by little, without even realizing it, we begin to build an internal narrative, a narrative about who we should become, a narrative about what we must achieve, a narrative about what will give value to our lives. But there is something interesting about this narrative. It rarely arises from pure awareness. It arises from identification. Identification with expectations. Identification with roles. Identification with stories that have been repeated so many times that they begin to feel true. For years, maybe decades, this narrative functions as an internal engine. It gives direction. It creates motivation. It gives the impression that we know where we are going. But awakening begins to touch precisely this point. Not aggressively, not dramatically, but quietly. First a small doubt appears, then a strange feeling, then a subtle distance, and something begins to happen. You begin to notice that many of the things that once seemed essential were simply parts of this narrative, not necessarily parts of your true nature, but parts of the story you learned to tell about yourself. And when this perception begins to emerge, something inevitable occurs. Motivation built on these stories begins to weaken, not because you became lazy, not because you lost your strength, but because the internal system that sustained those motivations is being questioned. And when a system of meaning begins to be questioned, it does not disappear immediately. It collapses slowly. First small cracks appear, then moments of doubt, then moments of silence. And inside that silence, something very important begins to unfold. You begin to realize that much of your life may have been spent pursuing things that seemed important, but were never truly yours. Maybe they were expectations, maybe invisible pressures, maybe simply paths that others followed before you. And then a very peculiar sensation appears, a sense of suspension, as if you were standing between two worlds. The old world, where everything had clear meaning, and a new space, where meaning has not yet been defined. This space can feel deeply uncomfortable because the human mind has been trained to avoid emptiness. The mind always wants to fill everything with explanations, with goals, with narratives. But when awakening begins, something different happens. For the first time, the mind encounters a space where the old answers no longer work. And this creates a very particular kind of internal silence, a silence that may initially feel empty, but is actually just the absence of noise. For years the mind was busy trying to keep a story functioning. The story of identity, the story of social roles, the story of who you believed yourself to be. But when this story begins to lose its strength, the mind enters unknown territory, and in that territory something curious begins to happen. You start observing your own mind. Thoughts arise, but they no longer feel as convincing. Desires appear, but they no longer feel as urgent. Worries surface, but they no longer feel as real. And slowly a new way of perceiving begins to emerge. A perception that depends less on the story the mind tells, and more on the simple experience of being aware. This is one of the first signs that something deeper is happening, because what is changing is not only the meaning of things. What is changing is the place from which you perceive life. Before, everything was filtered through identity. Now, little by little, something different begins to appear. Observation, presence, awareness. And this is where many people become frightened. Because when identity begins to weaken, an inevitable question arises. If I am not just this story, then who am I? But this question does not need to be answered yet. In fact, it cannot be answered immediately, because before something new can emerge, something old must end. And that is exactly what is happening when nothing feels important. Life has not lost its meaning. The old meanings are dissolving, and before new ones can arise, there is a pause, a silent interval, a space where everything feels suspended. But this interval is not a mistake. It is a passage between two completely different ways of living. And in the next step of this journey, something even more unexpected begins to unfold. Because when the old meanings disappear, awareness begins to reveal something that has always been there. Something that never depended on achievement, never depended on approval, never depended on identity. But before we look at that, we need to understand why this process can feel so profoundly lonely. There is a part of this process rarely discussed. A quiet part many go through completely alone. When old meanings dissolve, something inevitable happens. The way you relate to the world begins to change. Not because you decided to change, but because your perception has perception. When perception shifts, everything once natural transforms. Conversations once normal may feel strange. Comfortable environments suddenly feel artificially noisy. Social dynamics reveal what was invisible. Small games of approval, silent competition, constant need for validation. Before, this was landscape. Now it's visible, more obvious. The more obvious, the harder it is to ignore. This doesn't mean you're better or more evolved. Often, it means the opposite. You realize how much you participated in these dynamics for years, perhaps trying to fit in, or prove something, or living up to expectations. But when awareness expands, something curious happens. You see these dynamics were never natural. They were simply collective habits. patterns of behavior that everyone learned to repeat, almost like an invisible script that nobody realizes they are following. And when you begin to see that script, something inside you begins to step back, not with hostility, not with arrogance, but quietly, like someone watching a play while the rest of the audience is still deeply immersed in the story. This moment can feel deeply lonely, because for a long time human connection was built around those same stories. Stories about success, stories about status, stories about identity. But when those stories begin to lose their meaning within you, your connection with certain people may begin to change. Not necessarily because they did something wrong, but because you may now be looking at life through different lenses. This can create a strange sensation, a feeling of distance. Suddenly you notice that certain conversations no longer flow the same way. Certain interests no longer spark the same excitement. Certain environments no longer provide the same sense of belonging. And then a quiet question may begin to arise. Am I drifting away from people? Or am I simply beginning to see something I couldn't see before? This is one of the most delicate questions of awakening, because for a long time we believed that belonging meant thinking the same way as everyone else. But perhaps true belonging has more to do with authenticity than adaptation. When awareness begins to expand, the need to maintain certain masks begins to fade. You start realizing how much energy was spent trying to sustain specific versions of yourself. Versions that were accepted, versions that were understood, versions that were expected. But now something has shifted. The old motivation to maintain those versions begins to dissolve. And with that, a strange space appears. A space where you are still discovering who you are, without the need to follow the old scripts. This space may feel lonely, but something important is happening within it. Because when old connections based on roles begin to weaken, a new form of relationship begins to emerge. A relationship based on presence. A relationship based on awareness. A relationship based on something far simpler, being. But before this new form of connection becomes clear, there is a transition period. A period where you may feel you no longer fully belong to the old world, yet still do not fully understand the new one. It is like standing on a bridge. Behind you lies the life you once knew. Ahead of you lies something that still has no shape. And in the middle of this crossing there is silence. A lot of silence. But inside that silence, something very important begins to appear. A voice that may have always been there, but was previously drowned by the constant noise of the mind. A quieter voice, a deeper voice, a subtler voice, the voice of awareness. And when that voice begins to appear, the journey starts to change completely. Because once you begin to hear that voice, the need to search for meaning outside of yourself begins to fade. But this is something we must explore carefully. Because the inner voice does not appear as an immediate answer. It appears first as a whisper, and often almost imperceptible. There is a very specific point in this process where something begins to shift again, after the silence, after the sense of emptiness, after the strange impression that nothing seems to carry the same importance. Something subtle begins to emerge. Not dramatically, not like a sudden revelation, but like a quiet perception. At first, it is almost imperceptible. A small shift in how you observe your own thoughts. For most of life, the mind functioned as a constant narrator, commenting on everything, interpreting everything, judging everything. The mind always had something to say, about who you are, about what you should do, about what it means to live a correct life. For years, this voice was mistaken for you. It was as if the narrative of the mind was your identity itself. If the mind said something, it felt true. If the mind criticized, it felt final. If the mind created worries, they felt absolutely real. But when awakening begins to unfold, something curious happens. You start noticing the mind as mind. This may seem like a small detail, but it is actually a massive shift. Because for the first time you begin to observe your thoughts as something appearing within awareness, not as something defining who you are. This moment creates distance, a small separation between awareness and mental narrative. And inside this separation, something new becomes possible. Observation. Thoughts still arise, ideas still appear. Worries still move through the mind, but something has changed. Now there is space between you and those thoughts. Like clouds moving through the sky. They appear, they move, and eventually they dissolve. For years, every thought seemed to carry enormous weight. Now they begin to feel lighter, more temporary, more fluid. This does not mean the mind disappears. It continues to function. But it loses the absolute authority it once seemed to have. And in that moment something interesting begins to happen. Another form of perception starts to emerge. A perception that does not depend so much on constant mental analysis. A more direct perception. More intuitive. More silent. It is as if you slowly begin to trust a deeper internal sense of clarity. A clarity that does not need to be explained through words. It simply appears, like a quiet understanding, without effort, without struggle, without the need to convince anyone. This type of clarity does not come from logic, it comes from presence. When the mind is constantly busy trying to control everything, this clarity rarely appears. But when the mental noise begins to fade, something begins to reveal itself, and many people describe this moment as if a new internal compass is appearing, a different kind of orientation. Before, life direction was based on goals, objectives, expectations, comparisons. Now, something quieter begins to guide decisions, an internal sense of alignment. Some things simply feel right, others simply stop making sense, without long explanations, without the need to justify. This inner guidance can feel unsettling at first, because for most of our lives we were taught to trust external reasoning, strategies, plans, calculations. But now something different begins to appear, a deeper perception of experience itself. And this changes the way life begins to organize, because when this inner voice begins to emerge, choices begin to shift, not because someone told you they should, but because certain things simply stop resonating, certain paths lose their energy, certain decisions start to feel artificial, and little by little a new way of living begins to unfold, a way of living less based on pressure, and more based on awareness. But there is something extremely important here, that many people do not notice. This new type of guidance does not appear as ready-made answers, it appears first as sensitivity. Sensitivity to perceive when something is in harmony, and when something is not. It is almost like learning a new internal language, a language that was always present, but never truly listened to. And the more you begin to hear that silent language, the clearer it becomes. But there is one important detail. Before this clarity becomes stable, something else still needs to happen. Because what is dissolving is not only the old motivation, what is dissolving is an entire structure of identity. And when identity begins to dissolve, an inevitable question arises. Who am I without this story? There comes a moment in this process when the question stops being merely intellectual. Until now, you may have observed changes in how you perceive the world, changes in how you perceive your motivations, changes in how you perceive your relationships. But now something begins to happen at a much deeper level. The question stops being curiosity. It becomes experience. Who am I without this story? This question may seem simple, but when it begins to arise genuinely within awareness, something profound starts to unfold. Because for most of our lives, what we call the self has been constructed through stories. Stories about who you believe you are, stories about what happened in the past, stories about who you should become in the future. These stories repeat themselves so often in the mind that they begin to feel solid. They seem to form an identity that appears stable. But when awakening deepens, something interesting begins to happen. You start noticing that these stories are narratives appearing within the mind, narratives organized around memories, around interpretations. It changes over time, it reacts to circumstances, it adapts to expectations, it transforms depending on the environment. And then a curious realization begins to appear. If this character can change so much, perhaps it is not something fixed. Perhaps it is something constantly being created. Created by memory, created by interpretation, created by the internal narrative of the mind. This realization can feel deeply liberating, but also unsettling. Because if the character is not completely solid, then who is living the experience? Who is observing all of this? This is the point where many wisdom traditions begin to suggest something different. They begin to point toward the possibility that what you truly are is not the character. What you truly are may be the awareness in which the character appears. At first this may feel like an abstract idea, but when the mind begins to quiet down, this insight starts to become clearer. Because when you observe your thoughts, you notice that they appear within awareness. When you observe your emotions, they also arise within awareness. When you observe your memories, they too appear within the same space. And gradually, something becomes evident. Everything you experience appears within awareness. Thoughts appear, sensations appear, stories appear, identities appear, identities appeal, but the awareness that perceives all of this remains. Recognizing this can transform the way you see yourself, because it reveals something very important. You are not only what the mind says you are not only the stories constructed about your life, you are not only the character you learn to play. There is something deeper, something quieter, something that was always present before any story. Awareness. And when this recognition begins to stabilize, something interesting happens. The need to maintain certain identities begins to fade. The need to defend certain opinions begins to soften. The need to constantly prove who you are begins to dissolve. Because if you are not merely the character, you no longer need to protect that character all the time. This creates a sense of lightness. A lightness that does not come from achieving something, but from releasing something, releasing the constant need to define yourself, releasing the need to explain yourself, releasing the need to maintain an image. This process does not happen instantly. It unfolds gradually. The mind still tries to return to old patterns, it still tries to rebuild stories, it still tries to restore the old certainties, but something has changed. Now there is awareness of the process, and when there is awareness, identification begins to weaken. Thoughts still arise, but you begin to notice you do not have to believe all of them. Emotions still arise, but they can be felt without defining who you are. Memories still exist, but they stop being a prison, and at this point something very important begins to happen. Life becomes more direct, simpler, more present, not because all problems disappear, but because the relationship with experience changes. And when this shift happens, a new question begins to arise. If I am not merely this character, then how should life be lived? There is something deeply paradoxical about this stage of the journey. For most of our lives we believe that meaning must be found, that we need to discover something that gives significance to our existence, something that justifies our efforts, something that explains why we are here. And then, when awakening begins to unfold, something unexpected happens. The meaning that once felt so important begins to dissolve. At first this can feel unsettling, because the mind has been trained to believe that without meaning, everything becomes empty. But what many people discover during this process is something very different. The emptiness that appears is not the absence of life. It is the absence of illusion. For years, perhaps decades, the mind built an entire structure based on meanings that seemed solid. Meanings about success, meanings about identity, meanings about what it means to live well. But when those meanings begin to dissolve, something curious begins to happen. Life does not disappear. In fact, it becomes more direct, simpler, more real, because when the stories begin to lose their power, what is happening right now becomes more visible. The sound of the environment, the sensation of the body, the quiet presence of awareness. For a long time these things seemed secondary. Now they begin to feel central, and at this moment something very important begins to emerge. A new relationship with experience. Before, most of our energy was directed toward interpreting life, trying to understand it, trying to control it, trying to shape the future according to certain ideas. But as awakening deepens, something different begins to happen. Life starts being experienced more directly, with less mediation from mental narratives. This does not mean thinking stops. The mind continues to function, it continues analyzing, it continues planning, but it no longer occupies the absolute center of experience. And when that happens, an inner space begins to open, a space where something far quieter begins to appear, something that does not need to explain life, something that does not need to justify existence, something that simply is present. This presence may seem very simple, so simple that the mind may ignore it at first. But the more it is recognized, the clearer it becomes, because it was always there, before every thought, before every story, before every identity. Awareness. And when awareness begins to be recognized more clearly, something interesting happens. The search begins to change direction. Before, meaning seemed like something that had to be found in the external world. Now a different realization begins to emerge. Perhaps meaning is not something that needs to be constructed. Perhaps it is something that naturally unfolds when life is lived with presence. This realization does not come as a logical conclusion. It emerges as a gradual recognition, a quiet maturation, and in that maturation something new begins to appear. A different kind of trust. Not a trust based on control, but a trust based on listening. Listening to experience, listening to awareness itself. And this is exactly where the journey begins to open into something even deeper. The recognition that there is another way of navigating life. A way that does not rely solely on the mind, but on something far more subtle. Inner awareness. For most of our lives, the mind served as the primary navigation system. It analyzed, compared, planned, but now something else begins to emerge. A quieter way of sensing what feels aligned, and what does not. A more intuitive way of perceiving when something carries truth, and when it has lost its energy. This perception does not appear as a loud voice. It does not shout answers. Most of the time it appears as a whisper, a calm feeling, a quiet clarity that requires no explanation. But learning to trust this perception is a journey of its own, because for many years we were taught to rely only on external reasoning, opinions, validation, systems that tell us what we should do. Now something different begins to appear. You begin to sense that there is guidance emerging from awareness itself, but learning to listen to this guidance requires something we rarely practice: silence, presence, attention, because the inner voice does not compete with the noise of the mind. It only appears when there is enough space to hear it, and that is exactly what we will explore in the next video. Because when the old structure of meaning dissolves, something new begins to arise. A different way of living, a different way of perceiving, a different way of trusting consciousness itself. In the next episode we will explore this deeply, learning to trust inner awareness, because when that trust begins to emerge, life stops being a constant search for answers, and becomes an ongoing discovery. If this video resonated with you, share it with someone who may be going through the same transformation, and write one word in the comments that represents the phase you are living right now. Sometimes a single word can reveal a lot about someone's inner journey. Continue the journey. Awakening is not a destination, it is a process. And I close, as always, gratitude for being here. Much light on your path. Quantum silence.